the climate change. So yeah, we'll have more chairs. Today I'm very pleased to have Professor Richard Schmalensee from MIT to deliver the distinguished lecture. Professor Schmalensee is the Howard W. Johnson Professor of Economics and Management and Director of the MIT Center for Energy and Environmental Policy Research. It's a very prominent center, a research center on energy issues. He served as the John C. Head Dean of MIT Sloan School of Management, and he also served as a member of the President's Council of Economic Advisors from '89 to '91. Professor Schmalensee is the author or co-author of 11 books and over 120 published articles. He's currently a member of the International Academy of Management and a member of the National Commission on Energy Policy and a fellow of the Econometric Society and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Today he's going to be talking about harnessing renewable energy. Please welcome Professor Schmalensee.
That kind introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here today and to talk about renewable energy. This isn't a talk about climate change per se, it's more an energy policy talk, but obviously renewable resources come up in any discussion of climate change. So let's do the prehistory, the early history first. This is U.S. energy use from the Energy Information Agency from, 1650 forward. And the main point of this is, if you look early on, it's renewables, it's wood, followed by water. And then people began to burn coal, which, living in New England, turned out to be a great environmental boon because it let the forests grow back that had all been cut down for fuel. So, the history of renewable electric generation starts about when the history of electric generation starts, right? Thomas Edison's Pearl Street station in September of 1882 in New York, a coal-fired generating station. 26 days later, the first hydro plant was opened in Wisconsin. So we've done a lot of renewable generation in this country, mostly hydro. In 1949, after a lot of dam building in the 30s, about a third of electric generation in this country was renewables, was hydro. That has declined. Hydro generation has actually increased since 1949, but not nearly as much as electricity consumption has. And the focus in all policy talks, and the focus in this talk, is on non-hydro renewables. So when I talk about harnessing renewables, I'm really mostly talking about non-hydro renewables and for electricity generation. But I will talk about non-hydro renewables more broadly. This is the share of non-hydro renewables in NHRs in total U.S. energy from '78 forward. There are a few interesting things to point out. From the bottom up, geothermal, pretty steady. Then wind. Notice the sharp ramp up in wind. Then biomass. We tend, when we talk about renewables, to think about wind and solar, but as we will see as the talk goes on, biomass, heavily wood and wood waste, turns out to be very important in the U.S. And elsewhere. And then biofuels, the wonderful ethanol program you begin to see ramp up. I will have nothing kind and indeed nothing to say about ethanol. And then other biomass, which is typically wood for heat. And then this curious yellow at the top, which is other solar. This is not solar for electricity. Some of it is solar for hot water. Most of it is those covers that go over swimming pools to heat them. That counts as solar heat. We lead the world in solar heat for swimming pools, probably because we lead the world in swimming pools per capita. But Australia's right in there with us. Other uses of solar do not appear in this chart. They're too small. If you focus just on electricity, you see the main sources, the main renewable sources. Again, biomass is not unimportant. I wish I knew exactly what happened in 2001. Somebody may know. I do know the dip in geothermal in the early 90s, which I will come back to. But the two points to be made here. First, look at the ramp up in wind, and this just goes to 2007. And second, look at the importance of wood and wood-derived and other biomass. The importance of biomass in electricity generation, non-hydro renewables, has dwarfed wind until quite recently and is still more important than wind. So that's generation. If you look outside the U.S., until the late 90s, 99 in fact, around 2000, non-hydro renewables were a good deal more important in the U.S. than in Europe, but basically our share is flat. Over that period, it grows from about 2% to about 2.5%. On the last data I saw, Michigan is running a little over 2 non-hydro renewables in electricity generation. But the U.S. share, you know, maybe, I don't honestly know offhand whether this is the peak or 2006 is the peak, but basically it's flat. Whereas Europe did very, very little and ramped up dramatically in recent years. The U.S. has a good deal of potential. This is the International Energy Agency. It talks about U.S. potential for non-hydro renewables. They actually did hydro, but I just took it out of the table. Notice the enormous potential for biomass. Wood waste, some of it municipal solid waste. All of these are important sources in various places. Enormous potential for biomass, also enormous potential for wind. According to the International Energy Agency, the wind potential of the U.S. is greater than almost anywhere else. If you took all of Europe onshore and offshore, it gets to be comparable. Notice also how much smaller the estimated potential is for solar, despite all of the talk about solar. And what a small fraction of the solar potential we've realized, less than 1%. So it's a relatively small potential, relatively small amount realized. In terms of realizing potential, we do better in biomass and we do better in wind. And geothermal looks to be about tapped out. According to the IEA, we have exploited about half the country's potential for geothermal, but are just getting going in wind and biomass. This is potential for wind. This is a different source, so the numbers don't quite add. The point of this chart is that there's a lot of wind potential, but the wind potential is heavily localized. If you look at Michigan does not make this list. I'm told if you use another source, Michigan would make this list, but this is onshore in particular. Onshore wind potential, an awful lot of it is in North Dakota, Texas, South Dakota, Kansas, and Montana. Those are notable because, aside from Texas and Kansas City and St. Louis, there are not a lot of people in those places where there is a lot of wind, which gives rise to debates currently in Washington about if we're going to use that wind, how are we going to get it to where the people are, and who's going to pay for getting it to where the people are. It's interesting that if you look down toward the bottom here, if you look up here, generation as a percentage of estimated potential, these numbers are pretty tiny. If you look down here, the 3 Pacific states, California, Oregon, and Washington, which don't have enormous potential, again, this is the National Wind Energy Association's estimates of potential. If you look at their potential is relatively low, certainly low relative to these, right? This would be potential in terawatt hours a year. I didn't put the units up. But they've done a much better job of utilizing that potential. California has used almost 10% of its potential, which is, and gets about 2.5% in 2007 of its electricity generated, not necessarily consumed, from wind. So we have a lot of wind potential. It's concentrated. Some states have done a great deal more than the U.S. average of about 2.5%. Maine. You may not be familiar with Maine. Maine is a few people on the coast and a few ski resorts and some lovely lakes and a whole lot of trees and a whole lot of commercial logging operations, particularly in northern Maine. And it is not too surprising that Maine generates a lot of electricity from wood and wood waste. A lot of it's wood waste, sawmill generation using wood waste for milling operations. But Maine gets well over a quarter of its electricity from non-hydro renewables. California, which stands out in terms of just sheer volume, as well as the percentage, gets a lot of its from geothermal. The other state, you can look down this list. Vermont has a lot of trees too. The other state, and Hawaii, everything else is expensive. But the other place that stands out, interestingly enough, is a place that most of us don't think of as particularly green or environmentally conscious. Particularly if you read the news on the latest Republican gubernatorial primary. Do not think of it as a green state, but it gets a pretty high percentage and a lot of power from wind. I'm going to say a little bit about California and Texas and how they got where they are. So some states have done more, and the Europeans, at least a few of them, and these are just 4 countries that used a lot of non-hydro, have done a lot more. Look at the German number. Germany gets 15% of its energy, of its electricity from non-hydro renewables. Look at the solar percentage. It gets 4.5% of its electricity from solar. You do not see numbers like that anywhere else. We'll come to how. It also gets a fair amount from wind, but, and people never talk about this, it gets a good deal from biomass. A good deal from biomass. Now I don't know the breakdown there, how much of it's wood derived and how much of it's municipal solid waste or industrial waste. The European data don't split quite the way the American data do, but I'm guessing most of that is wood and wood derived. The municipal waste and industrial waste are up there under waste, which by American standards is not a small number either. Municipal solid waste. So these countries stand out in a variety of ways. Look at, again, they're all double digits from non-hydro renewables. Finland has a lot of trees, does a lot of logging, a lot of forest products, so it's sensible that they generate a lot from biomass. Finland also does a lot of combined heat and power, where the waste heat from electricity generation is used for heating. In that climate, it makes sense, and they pushed it. Look at the wind number for Spain. 9% of total generation. Remember, the US number from non-hydro renewables, all of them, is 2.5%. In Spain, it's 9% from wind, and look at Denmark. Look at that. Almost 20% of their electricity comes from wind. We'll talk about how that works in a few minutes. But that's clearly a different system than any in the US. The Spanish system is different from any in the US, and the German system is different. Finland looks a little bit like Maine. Okay, that makes sense. But Germany, Spain, and Denmark look different. And Denmark, again, look at the waste number. That's a combination of municipal waste and industrial waste. And they get more from municipal and industrial waste than we get from all of these technologies put together. So it's clear from the US experience and the Spanish and the European experience that it's physically possible to do more than the US average. That's clear. And it's also clear that even if we don't do anything more than current policy, these are EIA projections of current policy. No national climate change legislation, and importantly, no renewal of legislation that's going to expire. So you will see that solar and wind grow pretty dramatically. But in fact, in this reference, they stopped growing after about 2016. And I had to scratch my head when I looked at the numbers. How can that possibly be? what economic force will change? Well, the economic force that will change is that the current legislation that provides a 30% cash grant for investment in wind and solar expires in 2016. That's a big subsidy, 30% check from the Treasury for your investment. Do I actually think that will stop, that will be allowed to expire in 2016? No. So this undoubtedly understates the growth in wind and solar, but the fact that in this projection that growth stops when the subsidy stops tells a lesson, and I'm going to come back to that lesson as well. The other interesting thing, and again, people neglect it, is wood, municipal waste, biomass. That's expected to increase by more than a multiple of 5.5 over this period, and to account for a significant fraction of U.S. generation. We always think about wind and solar. We always forget about mundane things like wood waste, biomass, municipal solid waste. So there's a but, and the but is a little hard to read here. These are EIA estimates of total levelized cost. So I'm an economist, and I always, when I'm thinking about policy, it's usually not a question of what we can do, but what we should do. And what we should do usually depends to an important extent, not exclusively, but at least to some extent, on the cost. So if you look at those cost numbers on the right side, you will see some of them, that they vary a lot. They vary a lot. This gas number undoubtedly assumes that you run the gas plant all the time, which you don't. But just take conventional coal plants as a benchmark. That's 100. You get a lot of electricity from coal in this part of the country. Now look at the numbers for wind, and look at the numbers for solar. So solar looks like 4 times as expensive. Photovoltaics is 4 times as expensive. Solar thermal, which really only makes sense in the desert Southwest, is 2.5 times as expensive. And even wind, that's offshore ocean, not offshore Great Lakes, but even wind is between 1.5 and 2 times as expensive. So if you build a lot of it and you pay for it, and you pay for it through electricity rates or subsidies, it's a cost. And the other thing about the ones I've circled, and you see it a little bit for solar, you don't see it for wind, you see the transmission investment column, you see showing a lot of more transmission for solar than for some of these other technologies, but not so much for wind. That assumes wind is located near the electric load. If you build windmills in North Dakota and you put new transmission lines to get it to Detroit or Chicago or Cleveland, those costs go up. And the other thing, which is important to recognize, is they need backup. They need backup. How does Denmark do 18% of its electricity generation from wind when wind sometimes blows and sometimes doesn't blow? Denmark has good connections to Norway under the ocean, and Norway has a lot of hydroelectric capacity. Norway has surplus hydroelectric capacity. So that when the wind doesn't blow in Denmark, hydropower goes to Denmark as backup. And when the wind is blowing in Denmark, they can sell wind power back to Norway. So Norway provides backup. How does it work in Spain? Well, in Spain, with all that wind, they don't have hydro in Spain. Spain is dry, you may recall. Spain doesn't have hydro. Spain has coal, but coal, first of all, it's very dirty. Spanish coal is very dirty, and they're trying to phase it out. And second, you don't ramp coal plants up and down. So what do? You build gas plants. You build more gas plants. But of course, the wind blows most of the time. It's just sometimes it doesn't blow in the locations where they put windmills. So those gas plants don't get to run very often. So you build gas plants and you run them only occasionally. This is not cheap. This is not a cheap proposition. Now, how much you need? Do you need one sort of megawatt of gas capacity for every megawatt of wind? No, because their wind is spread around and it never all stops, and so things aren't terrible. But it is an extra cost. It's not a cost you have for municipal solid waste. It's not a cost you have for biomass. It is a cost for wind, and if solar, it is also a cost for solar. Solar is a little tricky. Clouds are tricky. I'm told you have clouds here occasionally. Not today, so I got lucky. But on a cloudy day, the solar cells shut down. Not really cloudy day, the solar cells shut down. Clouds drift, right? So if you see the output from a solar photovoltaic operation, it can go up and down in seconds. At small scale, no problem. I turn my toaster on, I turn my toaster off, same thing. Large scale requires backup. Not the end of the world, requires backup. So those costs do not include backup costs, and they're high. So should we do more? And what should we do? Now, I will be a little controversial. There's clearly a case for supporting basic R&D, I would say particularly in solar. Particularly in solar, because we sort of need breakthroughs in solar. If solar is going to be at reasonable cost, it needs to get a lot more efficient. We don't support research in renewables much at the federal level. We spend a lot less on renewable energy research, at least historically, than we do for nuclear power, which also reduces CO2, but certainly a good deal less than for fossil sources. The support has been variable. Can you see this? The blue is dollars. You see it. There was a lot of excitement around 1980 when we had the oil shock and we were going to spend money on renewables and it was going to be great, and then the oil prices fell, and here's support for renewables, and here's support for renewables as a percentage of energy research. So in both absolute and variable and relative terms, we have not done a great job at the federal level of support for renewables. What about deployment? Well, again, the economist says, okay, deployment is a good thing. Let's talk about why. Why do we want more renewables deployed? In Europe, they talk a lot about energy security, and you even hear it here. But energy security in this country is an oil problem. In Europe, it's also a gas problem because they get Russian gas. But in this country, it's an oil problem. And we don't generate electricity with oil. So if you're substituting American wind for American coal, you're not doing much for energy security. What about jobs? Well, this is very popular, and I'm sorry, but this argument simply doesn't fly. There's the question of what would those people be doing otherwise, and if you say they'd be unemployed otherwise, then you have to ask the question, why not fix bridges? Why not repair roads? Why not build schools? There are lots of other things you can do to create jobs. Why is this a particularly good job creation thing? In Massachusetts, the governor desperately wants to build windmills offshore. Windmills offshore are really expensive, in deep water in particular. But he says it'll be Massachusetts jobs. And you say, wait a minute, where are the windmills going to be made? You bend metal in Michigan. We do not bend metal in Massachusetts. We talk about bending metal. We do the theory of bending metal. We do not bend metal. So they will not be made in Massachusetts. And the people who know how to install them, where will they get their, where will they be from? Well, they may not be from Massachusetts either, because we don't train people to install windmills because we're not installing windmills. So people will come to Massachusetts and install the windmills. And then people will live in Massachusetts and maintain them. How many? A lot? Is that better spending than on fixing the bridge I walk across every day to work? No. It's not. It's just not clear this argument stands the test of any kind of analysis. What about reducing costs? Okay. Making more computer chips reduces their costs. We don't subsidize that. Why? Because the chip makers get the benefit of the cost reduction. It's internalized, as in economist jargon. So if it's not a public benefit, why would you subsidize it? Okay. Where are they made? Windmills are made all over the world. Solar cells are made all over the world. Whose costs get reduced? Are there spillovers? If I buy windmills from China, does that make them cheaper to manufacture in Michigan? It's not obvious. Not obvious that knowledge transfers. So this is a potentially interesting argument, but I must say it's gotten very little support. How about building a U.S. industry? Well, that sounds great, but who's in the lead now? Are we in the lead making this stuff? Not really. And if you want to restrict imports, you're going to have legal problems internationally. You're going to have problems with the I'm now blanked on the trade, the successor to the ITO, the International Trade Organization. You're going to have legal problems. What about CO2 emissions? Okay, now we're someplace real. It's a weird argument in Europe, right? Because Europe has a cap on CO2 emissions. So if you subsidize renewables, then what you're saying is, we'll make the reductions via renewables, not in other ways. Is there any reason to think that's going to lower the cost of reducing CO2 emissions? No. By any reasonable argument, it'll only raise the cost of reducing CO2 emissions. In the US, of course, we don't have a cap. And we don't have a carbon tax. And we may not get one soon. So there is an argument here. It's like a third best policy, that we're going to subsidize deployment of renewables. It'll raise electricity rates, all of these things, but it will reduce CO2 emissions if we can back out particularly coal. So how do we do it? And that's what I want to spend some time on. And how do they do it in California and Texas, by the way, where we saw a lot of non-hydro renewable generation? So let's go to the EU. What did they do? There are two basic policies. They differ a lot by country, but they're two basic approaches. And they're very ambitious, by the way. They aim for 20% of all energy, not just electricity from renewables. And they have a biofuels program. It's biodiesel, not ethanol, but they have a biofuels program. But basically, it's going to come mostly from electricity. So I've heard numbers as high as 40% renewables from electricity from renewables. That includes hydro, but hydro isn't going to expand. So that calls for a massive, probably infeasible expansion of non-hydro renewables. So how did they do it? Most companies, most countries in the EU use either feed-in tariffs or output subsidies or a mixture. What that means is if you build a windmill in Germany, you basically sign a contract with somebody, usually the grid operator. You sign a contract that guarantees you so much per kilowatt hour for your output for 10 years. And if the facility's still going, you get market. Guarantees significantly, in the case of photovoltaics, less in the case of wind, for a fixed period. And then there's a complicated system to fold those extra costs into electricity rates. I mean, somebody's got to pay for them. They also have policies in every country that requires, if you build a windmill, it's the obligation of the grid operator. You have some obligations to finance connection, and the grid operator has some obligations. So, and there's siting issues. In Germany, a lot of these facilities are done in partnerships with local governments. So the local government gets something, and that helps with the siting issue. Very clever. The British tried something very close to the US RPS, Renewable Portfolio Standard, and they had trouble with it. It's the same thing that it's a closely related policy. When I, a windmill, generate a megawatt hour of electricity, I get to print a certificate that says 1 megawatt hour of non-hydro renewable electricity. And people who sell to consumers are required to buy a certain percentage of their volume of those green certificates, renewable energy certificates they're called. This program didn't meet its goals in the UK. The problem seems to be they couldn't get the facilities built. They seemed to have had siting problems. There was NIMBY problems, they didn't get them built. The people who were required to buy their certificates said, how can I buy their certificates if nobody's selling them? And it has broken down and is being rethought. The German thing, works in the sense that you put a large subsidy on something and you guarantee a very profitable revenue stream, you will get construction. And they got construction. The distinction between these two policies is a little like the distinction between a tax and a cap and trade policy, flipped around. The feed-in tariff is like a tax policy. The favored supplier, the wind supplier or the photovoltaic supplier or whoever, the municipal solid waste supplier, has no price risk. No price risk. And that's one reason why it has been a very effective subsidy. The riskiness in the system doesn't go away. Right? Supply goes up and down, demand goes up and down, fuel prices go up and down. All that risk is still there, and it is borne by other people. The risk is shifted from this supplier onto other folks. So the cost of the feed-in tariff to some extent understates the extent of the subsidy because it shifts the risk, but it works. The quantity result, how much stuff you get, is unknown. You set the tariff, you get what you get. Whereas with the cap, you know how much you're going to get if it works. As I say, the UK tells you that renewable portfolio standards can break down. Theirs did. I think others in the US have, but more quietly. You know what you're going to get if you can make it work. But you don't actually know what it's going to cost. And the builder, the windmill farm or the photovoltaic generator, doesn't know what kind of return they're going to get because they don't know how much those certificates will sell for. So there is risk borne by that supplier. So what have we done to subsidize deployment? Let me look at the federal level first. Interestingly enough, everybody forgets this, but we've had feed-in tariffs in this country. In 1978, the Public Utilities Regulatory Something Act, PURPA, it's always known as PURPA, nobody ever says what it's about, encouraged this use of feed-in tariffs at the state level. States were to allow certain qualified facilities, cogenerators and renewable providers, to sell, states were allowed to require utilities to buy electricity from qualified facilities, renewable and combined heat and power facilities, cogenerators, at the quote avoided cost of power and to sign long-term contracts. So states had to estimate what the cost of power would be into the future. Some of them were very generous. California in particular was very generous. So California guaranteed suppliers of certain technologies, just like Germany, a guaranteed revenue stream over time. Those are over. Since then, at the federal level, that whole regime has ended in the mid-'80s. Since then, the federal government has worked through the tax code. So depending on the time and depending on the technology, you either got a production tax credit, so many cents per kilowatt hour produced, or you got an investment tax credit, such and such a percentage of what you spent to build the plant. Now, working through the tax system makes it tough for startups, right? So if I want to build a wind plant, and the only thing that's going to make the wind plant profitable is the tax credit, I don't have any profits I can use the credit to reduce, right? Tax credit says you look at your profits, you subtract the investment, whatever tax credit you get, that's what you're taxed on. Well, if I don't have other profits, subtracting that isn't going to make the project viable. So there's been a big business, which nobody talks about, where investment banks connect startups to people with profits. And you manage to find a way to get that tax credit used. That's a waste of effort and costs a lot of money. Investment tax credits, I get 30% of whatever it costs me to build it. Period. So my incentives to hold down costs are reduced, and once it's built, I don't have any incentives to maintain the thing. I mean, I'd like to get the revenue stream from output, but basically I get no incremental incentives to produce. The production tax credit solves that problem, but it means that it can be profitable for me to produce even when the market price is negative, as it is sometimes in Texas. But the main criticism here is that the way we've done it at the federal level is it's been stop and start. Properly, these subsidy programs have limited lives. They sunset. But then when they're coming to the sunset, the question of will they be renewed goes up in the air. And what will they look like? Well, they always change. And sometimes they aren't renewed for a year or two. And you get a boom-bust cycle. Oh, and I'll show that in a second. For completeness, there are a lot of little programs. We have special programs for Indian tribes. We have special programs for municipalities. We also have household programs where the personal income tax is the issue. Now, most of us who might put solar cells on the roof actually have income, so it doesn't have the first problem. But it has other problems. So lots of programs. Here's the boom-bust cycle in wind. And you can relate the good years and the bad years to, was the subsidy solidly in place or not? Were people waiting to see if Congress would pass it? Was it in fact off? I'm not going to walk through it. I don't know it off the top of my head, but it's not like the industry is being dumb here or people are placing bad orders. It makes a whole lot more sense to build it if you get a 30% subsidy than if you don't. So if you can wait, you wait. That's not how you build an industry. That's not how you get the ball rolling if you really want to get the ball rolling in any kind of cost-efficient manner. So what about the states? What have the states done? Well, every state, there is a database, the DSIRE database, online, maybe .gov, .something, but if you just Google DSIRE, you will get more data than you ever wanted on state and federal programs to support renewables. Every state except Arkansas does something. Some kind of tax break, or a credit, or a property tax, or a special assessment, or something. They're all different. Every state does something different, and every state but Arkansas has a list of things they do. Sometimes it's only locally, sometimes it's statewide, but every state at the state level but Arkansas does something. I think Arkansas, some towns do things. So it's a very common, they all have regulations requiring grid connection, requiring various other things. They all differ too. They all differ too. The major thing is, nobody does feed-in tariffs anymore. There's a small one in California. There's one in California for very small facilities. But at scale, there isn't anything. 29 states have renewable portfolio standards, and the District of Columbia, just not to be left behind. It's a significant set, 62% of U.S. generation. The frustrating thing is, some places have a lot of wind, some places don't have much wind, some places have a lot of sun, some places don't have a lot of sun. It makes sense to concentrate renewable generation in parts of the country where it's cheapest. We don't do that. No two state programs are alike. So it would be hard to do interstate trades where I get credit in Michigan for wind energy generation in Minnesota. That would be hard under the legislation. A lot of states make it illegal. You can't do that. It has to be generated in state. By any standard, that adds to the nation's cost. That adds to the nation's cost. Most of these are recent. Michigan's, as you probably all know, came on stream in 2008. There are lots of other programs. And this just lists some of them that subsidize renewables. Sales tax, property tax, some rebates, some grants. The grants depend on whether it's appropriated. Sometimes subsidized loan programs. A complete symphony of different incompatible programs. And again, no interstate trading. You can't generate, you can't have somebody in North Dakota generate wind and get credit for it in Minnesota. It can't be done. I assume it can't be done between those two states that I just brought up as an example, because it can hardly be done between any two states. So, let's talk briefly about California and Texas, and then we will go to a few upsetting conclusions and some discussion, I hope, some questions. So California is an interesting case. The blue line is California's share of total U.S. non-renewable generation, and you will see it's like 37% around 1990. California was the clear leader, and it has declined over time. California's share of non-hydro renewables in California generation has drifted gently south over time. So what's California done? California had these wonderful early feed-in tariff programs that led to the construction of a lot of geothermal, some wind, even a little bit even a little bit of solar. These are solar thermal plants in the Mojave Desert that came on stream in 1983 and 1986, I believe. In any case, came on stream early in this program. What happened here? What happened here was those generous 10-year contracts expired, and plants didn't even find it economic to keep running when those contracts expired. They shut them down. So California and California's program menu is, I mean, they have thousands of programs in California. Every Democratic legislator can claim to have a program subsidizing renewables. Lots of little programs. Not much impact. That's not a share. That's kilowatt hours. California has been growing. That's kilowatt hours and not much growth, but lots of programs, lots of motion, lots and lots of motion. Texas. Oh, and the other thing is California has a relatively recent renewable portfolio standard. If you look at the law, the enforcement is left to the utility regulators. So it's one of those, come and tell me why you couldn't meet your quota. Oh gosh, that was hard. So I guess you're all right. Texas looks different. You don't think of Texas as a green state, actually, and the politics of this would be interesting, and I don't know the politics of this, but look at the wind growth in Texas. How did Texas do that? Did Texas subsidize? California's got a bunch of subsidies. Texas didn't subsidize. Texas didn't have a feed-in tariff. Texas had a renewable portfolio standard with two features. In the law, there is a fixed fine if you don't buy enough green energy certificates, renewable energy certificates. It's not up to the utility commission, it's not up to anybody else, it's arithmetic. You write a check to the state if you don't hit it. So the enforcement is pretty ironclad. And second, there's a state commitment which has been redoubled several times to get the transmission built. The wind blows in West Texas, the load is in East Texas, you've got to build more transmission. They're building more transmission. There's been a fuss about it, but there's been a clear commitment to do it. Now, why did Texas decide it wanted to ramp up renewables? I don't know. Not the sort of thing you'd think. But there's a renewable portfolio standard that works like a watch. Does just what they wanted it to do. There's some issues. There's some problems in the Texas system having all that wind come on stream that fast. But, you know, the lights are still on. The lights are still on. So let me make some concluding observations and then take your comments and questions. First, as I pointed out, support for renewables, non-hydro renewables in particular, in the U.S. has been relatively low and variable. You don't build an innovation machine out of variable support and low support for basic research. Second, my conclusion, subsidizing a good thing is usually less effective than taxing a bad thing if you want less of a bad thing. But if you can't do that, it may make second best sense to subsidize non-hydro renewables. The U.S. system, if you go through that whole maze that I just pointed you at, but kindly didn't walk you through, the only way you can see that system make sense is it is a design to hide the costs. In the German system, the costs are clear. Here's what extra you're paying for wind. There it is. You could debate it. It's debated in Parliament. In the U.S. system, you could never. I mean, the federal subsidies you can find, how much did they cost us? Well, you'd have to trace that out. You'd have to get into tax returns. What did it buy you? Hard to get. The state programs, hard to get. So it's almost as if we're trying to minimize the cost, minimize the visibility of the cost. As a colleague of mine says, we spend a lot of money trying to avoid knowing how much things cost. And that's true here. And it's also, and this is more serious, again, hard to put a number on, but that system where things are incompatible, you can't trade across state lines, subsidies vary over time, Programs are complicated and confusing. It's almost designed to minimize the bang for the buck. If we're going to subsidize deployment of non-hydro renewables, we ought to do it in a reasonable fashion that kind of doesn't hammer our electricity rates or our tax bills unnecessarily.
So we take some questions.
Absolutely. Yes.
It seems, however, that you're focusing more on centralized, even for non-renewables. So what I'd like you to comment on is, particularly from a jobs perspective in relationship to deployment, is a policy that would foster what I'll call massive rollout of really tri-generation systems on almost a home-by-home, business-by-business approach, and its impact both economically as well as jobs and so on.
We already have pretty significant, again, 30% of the cost is a pretty significant subsidy. So rooftop solar for commercial or individuals does get a pretty healthy subsidy. I think, and the second comment is, that's expensive power. Right? But by any measure, the way to look at it, a simple way to get it, is the German system, and you have to wonder who had this brilliant thought. The German subsidy system differs across technologies, is designed to make them all equally attractive. Why would you want to do, okay, so they do that. Well, the subsidy for rooftop solar is enormous to make it as attractive as wind. It's much higher. So it's expensive power. Is it jobs? Yeah, it is jobs. It's installation jobs. It's upfront jobs. And the question is that the best way to create jobs? It's not obvious to me that installing generation is better than saying having people work on energy efficiency, having people install double and triple glazed windows, having people insulate, having people do a variety of other things. It's not it's an expensive way to get electricity. And I don't know that it's a good way to do jobs. It might be, it'll do them. But I don't know that it's better than lots of other things you could do to do jobs. So you got to balance. You got to think about both goals. I actually think the confounding of jobs and energy and environmental policy has basically made it difficult to have a discussion. Because if you say, well, we're in a terrible economic crisis and jobs are a good thing, but there are lots of ways to create jobs. Right. You can build libraries like they did in the Depression. You can fix roads and bridges. You can build schools. You can have people be volunteer teacher aides. You can subsidize state and local governments so they don't fire people. There are lots of ways to create jobs. Is this dollar for dollar a good way to create jobs? I haven't seen evidence. So I'm a little bit of a skeptic. I think people are going to put in, as they are in California, they're going to put in rooftop generation for a variety of reasons, and that's swell. But I'm not sure I want to subsidize that as opposed to a lot of other things I might subsidize to create jobs. Sorry. Economists tend to be that way.
Yeah. I guess my first kind of comment is I actually see the trend of feed-in tariff policy in the U.S. going in the opposite direction, with a lot of states like Vermont, as well as Vermont's actually instituted a feed-in tariff policy, and then Wisconsin, Indiana, Michigan are also looking at statewide feed-in tariff.
At large scale?
At large scale.
Small scale installation?
Statewide feed-in tariff policies. But
the ones I've seen are all, maybe I haven't read the recent legislation, but the ones I've seen are all limited to small scale installation.
Oh, okay, I get what you're saying in terms of the cap on
yeah, no,
projects.
they're rooftop stuff, and that's fine.
I understand.
That's a much more efficient way to do it, but for grid scale, they still tend to rely on RPS.
Okay, no, I get what you're saying there.
And a properly designed RPS can obviously work, so it's not an apples orange, it's not a yes-no thing. Yeah.
My question is to biomass, and you kind of made it clear that you do have a fondness towards biomass, and I'm wondering, here in the state of Michigan, we have a lot of biomass opportunity, and a lot of companies are looking at that. How have other states or how have other countries balanced the resource of biomass when it's being looked at for electrical generation, when it's being looked at for biofuels? How do they balance that, and how do they actually use the resource in a sustainable manner?
Well, I think the one use that is clearly sustainable and is used in Europe more extensively than here, is municipal solid waste, right? That's biomass under most definitions. There isn't a sustainability issue. The issue is, can you produce electricity from it in an environmentally benign fashion, and the evidence seems to be that you can. The Europeans are at least as tough on that as we are. I'm not a big fan of having, this is me, I haven't done numbers on it. I'm not a big fan of massive tree farms for generating electricity. I think you run into scale problems with that, because the bigger the plant's capacity, the farther you have to transport stuff, and the more you have to work the life cycle of the forest. So I think that the scope is relatively limited. I mean, Maine isn't running forests to generate electricity. Maine is generating electricity because they're running forests for other things. So I think it's, you can have serious adverse environmental consequences from scaled up biomass. There's also biogas from landfills. That's, again, environmentally benign, to capture the methane, burn the methane. The reason I point to it, there are two reasons. First, discussions of renewables tend to neglect it, and in fact it's important and likely to grow if done right. And second, it, in terms of extra cost, doesn't have the extra cost penalty that distant wind and solar have. It's not intermittent, and it can be located close to load in many cases, particularly if you're using waste. Maine is not, and Maine is an issue, but a lot of waste operations can be located close to load, don't have the extra transmission capacity, and are, if not dispatchable, at least not intermittent. But I'm not a technology picker. I really think you look at cases and you look at impacts. So am I fond of biofuels? I think biofuels have been haven't gotten enough airtime. Do I think biofuels should displace everything else? I haven't seen that argument. I've just seen a neglect that I think they should be taken more seriously, because they have some good environmental and some good economic characteristics. They weren't the winners on that cost chart, for instance. Yeah.
So one of the sort of core numbers that I always talk about in answering about these things is the fact that ultimately, when you're talking about burning biomass, you're talking about transforming solar energy that was captured by the plants into, in your case, electricity, but whatever we want to use it for. Plants are extremely inefficient capturers of sunlight energy. In fact, if I go down to my local wimpy little science museum and buy a toy that has a solar cell on it, I'm getting a thing that's about 10 times as efficient as a plant at capturing the energy of light. And that's, a crummy toy. Research is, moving in the direction of substantially increased efficiency. And so, the other half of this issue is that you're talking about municipal solid waste as a significant fraction of the biomass for combustion, for electricity generation. So I would suggest that isn't actually expandable in other words, if we went to 10 times that,
no, we can't.
Talking about biomass as our generating foundation, we would then be talking about the infrastructure you were talking about, the gathering cost of going out and picking up the trees, etc. And so I worry that that the simplicity of simply imagining that what we do today, what we call biomass utilization, if we extend it, will be the same as what we're practicing today. I think that's wrong, and I think that core efficiency of energy capture is going to be one of the really important considerations in terms of the distributed versus centralized.
I agree with everything you've said. I think there is room to expand various kinds of waste and biomass generation, but not massively. Not massively. As I say, I haven't seen a good argument that says you ought to grow trees to burn them for power. I've seen great arguments that says that sawmills that have a lot of wood waste ought to use it for power and heat, which they tend to do. you also touch on a point that I wasn't about, which is biofuels, liquid biofuels. And I've heard exactly your point from people at MIT, which is why in heaven's name you can make plants a little more efficient by genetically tinkering with them, but there are limits, and there are a lot of sort of physical limits to what you can do, which is why you say, wouldn't it be better to find more environmentally benign ways to generate electricity and think about electrifying transportation rather than putting more land under cultivation for ethanol, for instance? As I said, the ethanol problem is one of my favorite, program is one of my favorite whipping boys, but this is not about that. So we are, I think, in agreement. Yeah.
I know your talk is about renewable energy, but you mentioned energy efficiency, and I wondered if you could take sort of a look back at some of your tables and look at, you did a lot of like potential for wind and potential for biomass as a percentage of like what we're actually doing. What would it look like if we looked at energy efficiency that way? If we looked at what sort of percentage dent that could make in our energy use?
Well, let me 2 points. One, that there have been a fair number of estimates, and the consulting company McKinsey has been sort of in the forefront, saying that there are in fact a lot of investments that would save energy and save money that are out there to be made. And I have to say, the initial economist's answer is there can't be a $20 bill on the street, somebody would have picked it up. But I'm persuaded, and I think most economists are now persuaded, that that simple answer is just wrong. Because if you look closely at those studies, yeah, they're a little optimistic, but they're not that optimistic. And if you try to sell households on relatively modest investments that will have like a 5-year payback, they don't get made. The rule of thumb at Home Depot is you can get people to make an investment in energy saving if it pays back within 3 years. That's a very high discount rate. So there is this sort of this mystery, which is why do households behave that way? They don't act in most aspects of life like they have a really that high a discount rate, but they do in energy efficiency. They will invest in a savings account that pays 2% and yet decline to make an energy efficiency investment that pays 10%. And it is a mystery. Serious behavioral scientists can answer this question, but I think it is a serious question. And people work at it. And I think the potentials there are significant. At the commercial and industrial levels, we have sort of the landlord-tenant problem. When I came back to MIT from Washington, I tried to get MIT to sign up to EPA's Green Lights program. And all that program said, I'm saying, guys, this is easy. We must look at lighting decisions on a life cycle cost basis. I said, how could people at MIT be opposed to that? And I finally had a conversation with the guy in facilities, an old crusty guy who says, let me explain to you, kid. Bulbs and fixtures come out of my budget. MIT pays for electricity, okay? So, and that's the landlord-tenant problem. So in commercial buildings, you have 2 different people making the decisions. It's hard to integrate them. I think the potential is very large. As to how much potential there is at zero versus how much potential at relatively modest cost, I don't know, but I think both are quite substantial. I think the challenge is, what economists say is, you want people to use less energy, put a price on it, and that's part of the answer. But the evidence seems to me to suggest that's only part of the answer. We ought to do that. My heavens, price it right. Price it right, and then try to get people to make decisions that are in their own interest, and we would save a lot. Question in the back.
First of all, I would like to thank you for this presentation. I'm here more or less by coincidence. I'm from a German engineer company.
Aha. So you can correct everything I said about you.
We are designing and constructing biogas facilities all over the world, actually, in Germany, Turkey, and now in the US as well. There was one aspect I missed in your presentation. You're talking about feet in tariffs, you're talking about kilowatt hours, about electricity. When we are thinking about a biogas plant, for example, put in anything, farming goods, municipal waste goods, any kind of feedstock, we try to close circles again. That means we have a good running CHP has an efficiency of 42%. So we are losing 58% efficiency when we are not using the heat, for example.
Right.
So this is a very, very important aspect to put things together. Or the residue of a biogas plant is a very, very high qualified fertilizer that could be used. Bring it back to the soil. And all these things has to be calculated as well, not only electricity.
Absolutely right. We do relatively little of that in this country compared to Germany. I think it's Denmark that's a leader in district heating, combined heat and power. The Russians used to do a lot of that back in the day when you could centrally plan. You put the generating plant, the waste heat goes into the heat goes into apartment heating. That 1978 purple legislation I talked about was designed to provide incentives for exactly that, combined CHP, combined heat and power facilities. It has not taken off in this country. It works better, of course, when there's growth, so you can integrate the production of the heat with the use of the heat. You're not having to retrofit to use it. But it is, you're right, I didn't talk about it, and the reason I didn't talk about it is an oversight, because it's just not discussed. But you're right. The efficiency benefits are substantial. Even in a warm climate like Michigan, there is some use for heat. Yes?
In Michigan, if you calculate the perma-style avoided costs for different renewable energy technologies, you would, for example, find that for biogas or other essentially dispatchable but continuously operated sources, you'd be looking at something like $93.
Actually, you probably can't dispatch CHP, but it doesn't matter because it's a base load.
Yeah. You'd be looking at something like $93 a megawatt hour. If you look at utility scale solar, and just because of time of day effects and seasonal effects, it's about $238. Those are real numbers from Michigan's electric distribution system. And it seems to me that's a fairly profound consideration that really wasn't addressed in the summary numbers that you presented. I know they're commonly addressed.
Yeah, the argument you're making is that solar power, I wouldn't make it well, I guess it is avoided cost the way you've done it, is that solar power is more valuable than something that runs 24 hours a day, or than wind, which tends to run more at night than in the day, because in fact peak power usage is in the daytime. Now, the problem is that in most places, and it's not a huge problem, but it is an issue, that solar power peaks before the load peaks. Solar power tends to peak at noon, and the load tends to peak maybe at 5 in the afternoon. So if you could just give me 5 hours of storage, just 5 hours of cheap storage, we'd have it. It does make a difference. It doesn't make, the Michigan numbers strike me as awfully different. The 90 strikes me as pretty high, actually, but never mind. But it does make it does count in favor of solar. It does. But the frustrating thing for solar power advocates is that little bit of storage to really hit the peak.
Yeah, maybe one more question.
So, what role do you see hybrid vehicles playing in this storage potential in the not too distant future?
You know, I'm right now co-directing and trying to organize, I would say, a study on the future of the electric grid. And it's some engineers and some economists and other types. And the engineers argue that, first of all, they tend to be hybrid advocates, or hybrid advocates. They think hybrid plug-in hybrid vehicles will penetrate more rapidly than most folks think. You know, the numbers I've seen, the Energy Administration Agency numbers are like 3% of the vehicle stock by 2030. It's like, that's not much. Other people say more, these guys say more, but they say the notion that you can use the hybrids as storage poses very difficult control problems. And when you charge and discharge the battery, you shorten its life. That'd be okay if you could figure out a way to compensate. So I'm plugged in at work, and you're going to control my vehicle, which is one of hundreds of thousands, and you're going to compensate me for the wear and tear on my battery. They argue that one thing that you can do with plug-in hybrids pretty easily, if the system is designed right, is you can slow the charge. So you can use them as a demand control device. Of course, they're not going to be charging typically at peak time, but some will be. So if you design the system right with proper incentives, it's not going to matter too much to me most of the time if my vehicle charges in 2 hours or 2.25 hours, and it may matter to the system. That you can do pretty easily. Doesn't cost me anything, doesn't wreck my battery, but to charge it and discharge it, they are skeptics. Now again, I've got some smart people. I've said, can you guys prove this? I mean, you prove you can't do this? Whenever engineers say you can do something, they're right. When they say you can't do something, they're only right part of the time. They're working on the question, but these are some fairly smart power guys who say that's just hard. The popular notion that you can use them as storage devices on the system in a way that users will put up with is very hard. Maybe it's soluble, but right now they're skeptics. They see them as useful to moderate peak, or if something goes wrong in the system, right? A big power plant shuts off. All right, then you just stop charging the electric vehicles, and all of a sudden you've dealt with that problem until you can bring backup power on. That's easy, and that's a good thing. But whether you can actually use them to supply power, not so clear.
Okay, thank you very much. And we're going to have a reception afterwards, and you can continue the discussion. Thanks.